Why does a massive, highly successful company that manufactures industrial steel suddenly decide to buy a chain of fast food restaurants? It sounds like it's a typo in a financial report, but in reality, moves like this happen all the time in business. And it's one of the most dangerous high stakes maneuvers in the corporate world. I mean, it really is the ultimate gamble. From the outside, when we look at major corporations, their growth, I think, feels almost inevitable sometimes. Like they somehow possess this crystal ball that tells them exactly what product to launch or which country to expand into. But behind closed doors, that there is no crystal ball. It's far more like sitting at a high stakes casino. Executives are staring down at their stack of chips, their resources, their capital, their talent, and they're trying to figure out which bet is going to double the size of the business without accidentally bankrupting the entire operation. Welcome back to The Strategy Show, the podcast that connects real-world business events with the strategy concepts that help us understand them better. I'm Ben Dixon-Green, and today we're going to be looking at the actual mechanics of how companies decide to grow. Because whether you're running a multinational conglomerate or trying to scale a scrappy little tech startup, or even just plotting out your own personal career, eventually you're going to hit a wall. Sales are going to stall, promotions are going to dry up, and when you hit that wall, you have to decide where to place your next bet. Now, to understand how those bets are calculated, we're going to look through the lens of a classic business framework, which is called Ansoff's Growth Vector Matrix, or sometimes just Ansoff's Matrix. Now, this sounds incredibly academic, but what we're going to try and do is strip away all the jargon today. Think of this matrix as really just a compass for evaluating danger. It basically maps out 4 distinct directions that a business can take to grow based on 2 very simple variables: the products you sell and the markets you sell them to. So you either stick with what you already have, or you try to invent something entirely new in each of those variables. Now, what's fascinating here is that this compass doesn't just list ways to generate revenue, it actually helps you think about risk. Because every time you step away from your existing products or your existing customers, the risk of catastrophic failure multiplies. So let's start with the absolute safest bet on the table. It's the bottom left corner of Ansoff's matrix, which is called market penetration. This is when a business pushes its existing products into its existing markets, so playing purely on your home turf as a business. Think of it like a sports team playing in their own stadium. They know the weather, they know the pitch, they know the fans. Now, let's put it into a business setting. Let's imagine a hypothetical business. We'll call it Tech Corp. They make high-end vacuum cleaners, and they currently sell them in the US and the UK. A market penetration strategy means Tech Corp just tries to sell more of those exact same vacuums to more people living in the US and the UK, where they currently sell their products. So the underlying growth mechanism here is just about capturing market share, because you're not inventing anything new, you're just trying to squeeze more revenue out of a system that pretty much already works for you. So what does that look like in practice? Well, you might ramp up advertising budgets, or you might aggressively widen your distribution channels, like making sure those vacuum cleaners that you sell are stocked in every single retail store, not just the high-end specialty appliance shops. Or you launch a loyalty program to get current customers to upgrade their vacuums more frequently. Now, one of the most common tactics people mention for market penetration is aggressive price cutting. The idea being you drop the price and more people buy the vacuum, which is perfectly logical. But we do need to be very careful with this. I mean, if you're slashing your own profit margins, how is that sustainable growth strategy? Well, the goal of a price cut isn't necessarily immediate profit. The strategic play is to secure dominance of a growth market, or to aggressively restructure a market by basically starving your competitors of sales, hopefully until they're forced to leave. It's kind of a war of attrition. You take a hit on margins today so you can own the entire industry tomorrow. But there are a couple of risks inherent with this sort of strategy. First of all, there's a risk that your rivals find ways to slash their own prices and they don't leave the market. in which case you've just created a situation where the whole market, including you, has cut their profit margins for no benefit at all. I mean, this is great for the customers because the price war that you've created has driven their prices down, but it's terrible for the bottom lines for all the companies in the industry. Slashing prices also carries quite a big psychological danger. If your premium top of the line TechCorp vacuum cleaner suddenly goes on a massive 50% off sale, customers are going to notice, and they might start assuming, possibly incorrectly, that the customer has switched to, cheaper plastic parts, or that the brand is losing its prestige. And that's one of the really big pitfalls of the price cut tactic, because it can permanently damage a brand's image of quality with the customer, which is really hard to recover from. But in spite of all this, if we kind of zoom back out again to look at market penetration as a whole, market penetration remains the lowest risk option on Ansoff's matrix, because you aren't spending millions on research and development for an unproven invention. You're not navigating the legal hurdles of a foreign country. You're just kind of tweaking and optimizing what you already have. But there's a massive catch to playing on your home turf. What happens when you've literally sold a vacuum to every single person in the UK and the US who wants one? Well, you hit a ceiling. The market becomes completely saturated. If the company wants to keep growing, they're forced to change one of the variables and have to step out of their comfort zone. This moves us into the medium risk territory of the matrix, because the business can either change the market that they operate in, or they can change the product they're trying to sell. Let's look at changing the market first of all. This is called market development. So on Ansoff's matrix, this is where we take our existing proven product and you try and find a brand new market for it. So TechCorp takes that exact same vacuum cleaner it's always sold, makes absolutely no changes to the motor or to the design, and starts shipping it to Asian markets. Or instead of selling to everyday homeowners, maybe TechCorp starts pitching bulk orders to massive corporate hotel chains. So in either case, the product is identical, but the end user profile kind of fundamentally shifts. Now, this doesn't have to just be geographic expansion. Moving into new distribution channels can act as market development too. I mean, think about organic food. 20 years ago, organic produce was sold pretty much exclusively in specialist kind of health food shops. But when those same farmers started placing identical organic apples into mainstream conventional supermarkets, they opened up an entirely new demographic of buyers. Or if you look at resorts, holiday resorts often have standard winter vacation packages that sell incredibly well to young families. To develop a new market, they take the exact same hotel, the exact same beach, and they offer deeply discounted, up to month-long stays during the off-season, specifically targeting retired couples. So same product, but totally different market segment. It's an incredibly efficient way to use your existing assets. But, there's always a but. We need to look at the risk calculation here. Moving into a new market increases the danger to a medium level. Why is that? I mean, if a company knows exactly how to manufacture a vacuum cleanly, efficiently, and profitably, why is the risk notably higher just because they're shipping it to somewhere else? Well, the reason is that the physical machine hasn't changed, but the environment it operates in has. The danger lies in the unknown variables of that new audience. Customer needs might be wildly different. Maybe the homes in that new Asian market for TechCorp predominantly feature a different type of hardwood flooring, and the TechCorp vacuum brush actually damages it. Or there are other invisible hurdles, unforeseen trade barriers, new tariffs, or entirely different regulatory compliance laws when you try and break into that new country or new market. So a product that's a flawless success in London could actually turn into a massive liability in Sydney if you haven't anticipated those local nuances, those differences with the new market. Now that's why if you do decide to go for market development, it requires really rigorous ground level market research. You can't just wing it. You might understand your product perfectly, but assuming you understand a new customer base without putting in the work is a fast track to absolute failure. Okay, let's look at the other medium risk path. We hit the ceiling, but instead of finding new customers, we decide to lean into the customers we already have because we know their buying habits intimately. But we offer them something brand new. This is product development. So we develop a new product for our existing customers. Now, this strategy is usually triggered by a few specific scenarios. For example, customer needs might be evolving naturally over time, or there might be a sudden change in demand that's created a gap in the market, or maybe a rival company launches an innovation that forces you to respond. So what you do is you exploit your existing relationship, that trust you have with your current base of customers. You invent a brand new product or you heavily redesign the old one and you sell it to them. You sell it to those existing customers. The logistical advantage here is huge. You already have the marketing channels. You already have the reputation with the customers that you can trade on. You also already have the trucks and the warehouse relationships and the supplier links. So you can almost literally just swap out the old boxes for the new ones. And zooming out to the broader industry, product development can actually act as a very powerful defensive tool as well. Because when you consistently launch new, improved products to your existing customer base, you force your competitors to constantly scramble and play catch up. And also, it drastically raises the cost of entry to the market. A scrappy new startup is going to have a much harder time stealing your customers if you're already fulfilling your customers' desire for the latest and greatest features. But again, product development carries a medium risk. If we already own the distribution and we know the customer so well, where's the danger coming from this time? Well, you can probably guess. The blind spot here is the invention itself. Does the new product actually match the customer's needs? Let's use a classic real-world example of this. Think about New Coke in the 1980s. This may have been before many of your times, but in the 1980s, Coca-Cola launched a brand new version of Coca-Cola, a brand new recipe for their drink. Now, Coca-Cola knew their market better than anyone on earth. They had the distribution network, they had the brand name. But when they launched this heavily redesigned product version of Coca-Cola that they advertised as New Coke, it completely missed the mark regarding what their customers actually wanted. It caused complete and utter uproar. People hated it. And the danger of a misstep like that isn't just that the new product fails to make money. I mean, yeah, a clunky, unwanted, or poorly manufactured new release can severely damage the core brand's overall reputation. But there's a risk that, for example, in this case, Coca-Cola's customers might just switch to a rival drink like Pepsi and then never switch back again. So you risk alienating the very base that you built your empire on in the first place, which in a business context is terrifying. So for product development, there is still this kind of medium risk attached to doing it. Okay, so let's look at our final area of Ansoff's matrix. Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when your market is just saturated? Your product line is matched out, you haven't really got any new markets that you can enter, but the company is sitting on a mountain of surplus cash. I mean, it's a good problem to have. I would like the problem of having a mountain of surplus cash, but for a business, it's still a problem. They want to aggressively spread their financial risk. So they look at the final quadrant of Ansoff's matrix, which is diversification. So this is creating completely new products for completely new markets. Now, this is the ultimate leap of faith for a business because you're abandoning both of your safety nets. You don't know the product, but you also don't know the customer. Really, this shares a lot of characteristics with a brand new business startup because what you're doing is you're deploying entirely new competencies from scratch. Now, we've said this is obviously very high risk. We can break this high risk quadrant down into two distinct categories. There are two types of diversification. There's related diversification and unrelated or conglomerate diversification. Let's have a look at related diversification first. This is where a company steps into areas that have some sort of logical, tangible link to their current operations. So it is a new product and a new market, but it's sort of linked to what they do at the moment. Now, this related diversification can happen either horizontally or vertically. Horizontal integration is developing activities that are kind of complementary to what you do now. Let's go back to TechCorp, our household vacuum maker. Let's say they decided to engineer like a heavy-duty ride-on commercial floor cleaner. It's a completely new product and it's aimed at a completely new market. So we'll be trying to sell this to, cleaning companies instead of everyday homeowners. But the mechanical engineering of the product is similar. A really nice real-world example of horizontal integration is a butter manufacturer who suddenly decides a huge market demand for skim milk. Because skim milk is literally a byproduct of making butter. And instead of discarding it, they package it, brand it, and sell it to, maybe more health-conscious consumers. So it's a totally different demographic and a different product to their kind of current butter sales. It starts as a windfall bonus, but it kind of leverages what they already do. Next up, we have vertical integration. This is diversification where we're moving up or down our own supply chain. Backwards vertical integration is where, let's say, a retail clothing brand decides to stop buying wholesale from external designers and they build their own factories and manufacture all the clothes in-house. So they basically become their own supplier. Forwards vertical integration is taking over the downstream process, like an electronics company deciding to open its own branded repair and servicing shops on the high streets, rather than letting third-party mechanics handle, broken screens and problems. The strategic theory behind vertical integration looks incredible on paper. You secure your supply chain, meaning you're not at the mercy of global shortages. You cut out the middleman, keeping a larger share of the profit margin at every stage of the supply chain. And crucially, it also reduces the bargaining power of your outside suppliers. If one of your suppliers is constantly upping the price of materials, you just buy their factory or you build your own. It sounds like the ultimate corporate power move. You control the entire ecosystem, from the raw materials being pulled out of the ground to the final customer ringing it up at the register. So why doesn't every successful company do that? The reason is that the underlying financial mechanics are incredibly dangerous. First up, vertical integration kind of drastically increases your fixed costs. Think about this. When you buy microchips from an outside supplier, that's a variable cost. So if the economy tanks and demand for your vacuum cleaners falls, you just order fewer chips. So your costs drop alongside your revenue. But the second you build your own factory to make those chips, you're on the hook. You have to pay the mortgage on the building, the maintenance on the machines, and the staff salaries, and all of that has to be paid regardless of whether demand is high or low. Your business risk skyrockets because you can no longer easily scale your production. On top of that, you also lose agility because you're locked into a particular supply. If a totally different outside supplier invents a new, revolutionary, cheaper microchip, you can't just switch to them. You're stuck using your own outdated in-house factory, or else you have to fire your own division. And actually, this leads to a fascinating psychological problem called dulled incentives. This is where an in-house supplier knows they have a captive guaranteed buyer, their own parent company. And that means they can get lazy because they don't have to compete for the business. They don't have to fight tooth and nail for the contract against hungry competitors. Now, that makes it sound like vertical integration is a disaster waiting to happen. But to be fair, some businesses absolutely do make it work. Early automotive giants like Ford vertically integrated everything very successfully. Henry Ford famously owned the rubber plantations in Brazil for the tyres the steel mills, the timberlands. And today, some Chinese electric car manufacturers are similar. They own lithium mines and battery manufacturing plants. What's fascinating here is how Ansoff actually accounts for that tension in his writings. He argues that a strategy's success depends almost entirely on how well a company forecasts the stability of its environment. Ford was operating in a stable environment. Early automotive growth was explosive, but very predictable. Everyone wanted a Model T, everyone wanted it in black because that was the only colour they did. And actually, arguably, it's similar for current EV demand in the Chinese market. It's growing very quickly, but it's fairly predictable. So these companies can afford to lock themselves into the massive fixed costs of steel mills and lithium mines because the demand was a steady upward line. Ford's vertical integration was the perfect strategic fit for a highly stable trend. A company operating in, let's say the fashion industry, on the other hand, well, demand there is by definition highly volatile. It's an environment of continuous, unforeseeable trends. They need the ability to pivot really quickly to new styles. But by buying a massive factory, they'd be building a highly inflexible supply chain. So, if they made jeans, denim jeans at the moment, and they built a factory that made denim, if suddenly the industry shifts to mean that, corduroy is now fashionable rather than jeans, well, it's that company, it's that fashion company that then has to figure out how to retool its factories, how to completely change around its production so it now makes corduroy rather than denim. That's incredibly difficult to do. So by kind of locking themselves into being their own manufacturers as well, a fashion company would trap themselves with those really fixed, rigid structures. Now, that leads us on to the final form of diversification, which is unrelated diversification or conglomerate diversification. This is where we launch new products and new markets, but the product is totally unrelated to anything we currently do. Essentially, we don't put all our business eggs in one basket by kind of operating in multiple industries at the same time. The idea being that if one industry underperforms, we're kind of buffered by the other industries we operate in being unaffected. Now, again, this sounds really sensible, but the failure rate for conglomerates is famously high. The big problem of conglomerate diversification is really differing managerial requirements. Just because a company's got brilliant executives who know how to optimize a steel mill, for example, it doesn't mean that they possess the ground level understanding required to run a clothing chain or a fast food franchise. It requires an almost superhuman central management team. And what you often find is that during economic recessions, that lack of expertise becomes fatal because essentially your managers don't know what to cut. So when a recession hits, focused companies make fast, highly specific cuts because they understand the mechanics of the single industry they operate in. A conglomerate central management team doesn't have that kind of nuanced understanding. They often enforce kind of clumsy, across-the-board budget cuts that then cripple their diverse subsidiaries. And a failure in one unrelated business then starts draining capital from the healthy divisions just to try and keep all the sinking ships afloat. And eventually the whole house of cards collapses. One final thought about this risky box of diversification. One of the big problems we've talked about is how hard it is to launch a fundamentally new business in a new market and how hard it is to then run it. The reason is that there will be barriers to doing that, including, our own organization's lack of skill and knowledge in this new market area. One way around that is to just go out and buy another company who's already in the industry. So, if Pepsi wants to expand into movie production, it doesn't try and set up a movie studio from scratch. It would go and find an existing film studio and then use its spare cash to buy it. So essentially, it would buy the brand and the skills it needs to make the chances of success in that new market much higher. The main drawbacks of this are really that you still have to manage the company you bought because you're their owners now. So you have to be able to make decisions about how that company should be operating. And also, it means a lot of outlay and a lot of decisions on how much that business is actually worth when you go out and buy it, all of which can be very complex and is very, very easy to get wrong. And that's it. That's Ansoff's 4 strategies: market penetration, product development, market development, and differentiation. So, what Ansoff's model gives us is this beautifully structured 4-box matrix. It makes business strategy look really clean and incredibly mathematical. But by the time we've actually chatted this through, we've started talking about the realities of, dulled incentives and conglomerate failures. It's probably become obvious to you that actually the modern business landscape is incredibly messy. So how well does Ansoff's model, which was invented in, the mid 20th century, actually hold up today? Well, the answer is it's a vital foundation model, but it does have some severe limitations in the modern era. The first major issue is how ambiguous the categories themselves are. The lines are incredibly blurry. Like, for example, what exactly defines a new product? If TechCorp decides to take their best-selling vacuum and they tweak the motor to increase suction by 10% and maybe change the colour, is that product development? Or is it just a market penetration tactic that's designed to keep their current customers upgrading? Inventing a commercial solar panel from scratch is clearly a new product, but releasing a pro version of a smartphone with a slightly better camera lives in a very murky grey area. Essentially what we're saying is that Ansoff's matrix just doesn't handle nuance very well, which is why modern strategic theory has actually expanded on Ansoff's work. One edition creates a 9-box Ansoff matrix. I know, the wonder. It takes the original 4 quadrants and adds a critical middle ground. So instead of just jumping from existing to new products, it introduces modified products. And instead of jumping straight to new markets, it introduces expanded markets, like opening a store just one town over instead of in a whole new country. Now, we aren't going to get into the depths of that model, but it does give us an idea of how the problems with this classic Ansoff model have been tackled. Ansoff's classic model also has some major strategic blind spots. The Ansoff framework inherently assumes that a company actually wants or needs to grow. Now, this is a very corporate-centric view, but it's not actually always true. Many business owners, particularly ones that aren't, big, giant corporate machines, are perfectly content making a very good profit with a stable operation, and they don't want to take on the massive headaches, debt, and risks of expanding. But the most glaring limitation is that the Ansoff matrix doesn't prioritize. In theory, a business can actually undertake all 4 of Ansoff's strategies at once. You don't have to do one or the other. But if a company has limited capital and it can only afford to make a single move, the matrix maps out the 4 options, but it offers absolutely no guidance on which quadrant is the absolute best choice for their specific situation. So think of Ansoff's matrix as being really more like a map, definitely not a GPS. It shows you the roads, but it doesn't calculate the traffic, the weather, or the fastest route to your destination. Which is why Ansoff can't be used in isolation. To survive, businesses have to combine it with modern environmental models, specifically things like SPENT and Porter's 5 Forces frameworks. Now, just to break those down, remember SPENT stands for social, political, economic, natural, or environmental, and technological factors. While 5 Forces looks at industry issues with the power of competitors, power of suppliers, threat of new entrants, competitive rivalry strength, and the threat of substitutes. Again, we're not going to go into them in massive detail, but both of those will give you views on the key issues in the outside world that might impact on your business. Before a company places a bet on a particular Ansoff strategy, they have to run it through those filters to try and understand the world around them, what it's doing, and hopefully to try and understand the market they're operating in. So let's say, for example, you want to try market development by selling vacuums in a new country. Before you make that decision, you might want to think about, what's the political stability like in that country? Where are the economic threats? So what are the interest rates like if we're going to need to borrow money to set up a factory? Are there big new technological changes that are about to make your product obsolete? So is everyone going to kind of automated robotic vacuum cleaners? Does the country that you're planning to expand into already have strong competitors who have an established brand name with vacuums in that country? Basically, Ansoff tells you the direction that you can travel in, but the extra environmental analysis tells you if that strategy is a good plan or not. So let's pull all this together. We started with the executives at the casino table. If you want the safe bet, you look at market penetration. Low risk, selling more of what you know to the people you already understand. When you hit the ceiling, you then look at the medium risk options. So you reach out to new audiences with market development, or you keep your loyal current customers, but you take a chance on innovating through product development. And finally, we have the high risk wild card of diversification, where we push into entirely new frontiers, risking kind of massive fixed costs, or somehow just hoping your management team is smart enough to juggle completely unrelated industries during, an economic downturn. The ultimate takeaway here is a new lens for decoding the business world around you. So the next time you see a familiar tech brand launch a wildly unexpected smart car, or you watch an e-commerce giant buy out a totally unrelated bricks and mortar grocery chain, you don't have to be confused. You can just look at Ansoff's matrix. You understand using this, the underlying strategy they're employing, that the factors driving them, and most importantly, the specific and rather terrifying financial risks that those executives are choosing to take. You can see exactly which bet they're placing on the table and why they felt forced to place it. But I want to leave you with a final thought to think about. Applying this exact same framework outside the boardroom. Think about your own life or your own career. Going forwards, are you relying purely on market penetration? Are you just planning to offer the same skills to the exact same types of employers year after year, hoping for a slightly better salary? It's the comfortable, low-risk route, but eventually you are going to hit a ceiling. What would it look like if you applied diversification to your own life, developing new skill sets for different industries? It's the highest risk quadrant. It requires stepping into the unknown. But as we learn from the corporate world today, sometimes staying comfortable in a saturated market is actually the most dangerous move of all. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategy Show. I hope you found it useful. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please follow the podcast so you won't miss future episodes. And also, please feel free to drop a comment on the episode. See you next time.